Everyone, welcome. I'm Chris Payne, Senior Partnership Success Manager at Pavilion. And today's session, Ramping Hiring to Hit Plan, is sponsored by our hiring practices channel moderators at Pavilion, BrightHire. And today we have joining us Teddy Chestnut, co-founder and CRO of BrightHire, and Jessica Klek, VP of Strategic Sales at 6 Sense. And as Teddy was mentioning, go ahead and feel free to drop in some things into the chat. Any questions you have along the way as well. Of course, you can take your mic off of mute throughout the session as well when Teddy opens up Q&A. And so without further wait, I'll turn it over to Teddy to kick us off. Teddy?
Cool. Thanks, Chris. Here, as if you couldn't see us, here we are. Cool. So hi, folks. I'm Teddy. I'm the co-founder and CRO of this company called BrightHire. We're working with Pavilion, focused on sales hiring because we think about hiring a lot. Like I'm personally growing my sales team, but we also, our product is focused on sales hiring, right? So if you have heard of Gong or Chorus, we have built a version of that for interviews and hiring, right? Record, transcribe, and capture interviews and figure out what's going on. And so we think about hiring a lot, and especially sales hiring. And I've joined here today by Jess Klek, who I overlapped with way back in the day at LinkedIn, and who went on to a much more illustrious sales career than I did at Cornerstone On Demand, and then Sales Loft, and now at 6 Sense, building strategic sales teams. And so she's going to share kind of her hard-earned experience on building those teams, ramping, and forecasting. And we thought we'd focus on this topic first. This is going to be a monthly series, but we focus kind of on the planning part first because that's where you start, and because there's a lot written about how to interview well and how to create exercises and certainly how to sell well as an IC, but there isn't a ton out there on this really important process of building the architecture and the process and the approach to actually scaling and ramping up a sales team. Jess has done it a number of times, and so is going to share her hard-earned experience in that respect. And so, our hope is that this is a discussion that you'll show up for this one and then participate for the ones that come, and that it will spark some thinking and some interesting exchange. So Jess, I'm going to kick it over to you, and it would be helpful to hear first a little bit about your experience at LinkedIn, Cornerstone, Sales Loft, and 6 Sense, the high level, just so we understand like the kind of teams that you've built, and then we can jump in from there.
Absolutely. Well, thank you, Teddy, for having me. Thanks, Pavilion, for having me, and hi to everyone. Yeah, this is an important topic that there's not a lot of help out there for. It's just sort of one of those skills that you are assumed to know how to do when you are building sales teams. But I've learned through the job, like many of you are doing or will do. First, as Teddy said, I had the privilege of leading several sales teams across LinkedIn, the last being helping our lynda.com acquisition, scaling 400 hires across North America. From there, I went on to Cornerstone, where I built an entire business division globally from 4 people to about 30 people. I did the same at Sales Loft, where we scaled our enterprise from 1 team to 7 teams across the globe. And now I was hired to do the same at 6 Sense, building out another North American team from the ground up, taking the 5 employees we have and already scaling to 13 and scaling to 36 in February. So these are, as Teddy said, hard-fought lessons and tips, hard learned, that I will share with you all. And as he said, I really want this to be interactive. So feel free to definitely chime in with questions or thoughts as we go through this.
Awesome. Thanks, Jess. So we're going to start with the overview of like the 3 big lessons that you've learned, so we know where we're going to go, and then we can dive into each of them. And I think we'll pause after each one, open it up for questions, discussion, and really get the room going. So 3 principles for forecasting hiring. Walk us through the high level.
First is a lesson, hard learned. Finance is your best friend, or really you should make finance your best friend, because ultimately they hold all of the keys to unlock the castle of you building. The second is AE churn is actually more costly than a pull forward hire. And I'll show you some math and some stats on how true this actually is, but this is probably the #1 thing I go up against every single time I'm building a team. And so it's important that we talk about it. And then lastly, communicating your plan early and often. I think this is, again, when you have more support across the org and across, function, they can really help with that, the shape of the plan, the capacity of the current employees, et cetera. So we'll dive into each of these, but there's a lot to unpack, and again, want to make it conversational.
Cool. So what's up with finance?
So finance is your best friend. This is very important because ultimately, when you're building and scaling out your teams, finance is going to have to approve it, right? They're the ones that ultimately hold the budget for the entire organization. And so many times in my past, I would go to finance and just expect that I would get the answer that I wanted, right? Like, well, I want to hire 5 more people. We have all these accounts. Why can't I hire them? And typically, I've had some math or some model I would share with them. But when I didn't have a former relationship with them, when the interactions were only about me asking for money, ultimately, I'd get no, right? And it would be a hard fought battle, and we'd have to include, other C-level stakeholders and like really map out why this is important. Over the years and in the roles that I continued to have, I made friends with finance immediately, right? And not just on my hiring plan, but even talking about forecast, right? Hey, here's my strategy for building this business out. Here's my forecast for Q1 and Q2 looking ahead. How is that tying back to the overall organizational goals, your goals as a finance leader? I found that when I was lockstep with my finance partners, that's when miracles happened. That's when the conversations got really a lot easier about them understanding why I'd be asking for something, specifically additional hires or pull forward hires. And so I would say finance and sales are like the yin and yang when it comes to ramping and hiring, because they want to tell you no. But if you can really get on their side and see sort of the business through their shoes, but more importantly, help them see the business through your shoes as the sales leader, that's where magic happens. Lots of lessons in there that we can unpack, but it's certainly a big one because it's probably the most tough of the hurdles to get through. So curious if you guys have any thoughts or comments about how to approach finance or any difficult conversations you've had. Happy to, chat through that.
So Jess, I have a question. Are there specific, like for me, where I am today, it's not necessarily, getting approval in terms of spend for hires. It's more of, hey, here's our objective, here's our goal, right? For next year in terms of revenue, and then backing into, like a sales capacity sort of plan, but also, with a bent towards combining it with like a waterfall, in terms of all the other things you need to generate business, right? And generate leads and things like that. So what specifically are you getting from finance other than just, hey, how much could I spend? What are you asking? What questions?
I'm partnering with them on building those models with me so that we are in lockstep. And when, instead of sort of doing it in a silo, right? Like, I guess that happens a lot, right? Finance is busy doing some other things. You as the sales leader, like, exactly, I'm going to build the waterfall. I'm going to build my capacity model. I think when you include finance in that build phase, that's when you build that trust. That's when they're more open to really understanding how you're thinking about your business and your strategy. And it makes them easier. It makes it easier for them to digest and sort of think about it, because now you've made them part of your strategy. Instead of you presenting your strategy to them, they are in it with you, right? It's just one of those things. It's like perception, right? Like the perception, and when you bring your model and all your math and you've carefully calculated this plan, they're not part of that plan. So make them part of that plan. And that's why I said, like, even now building, one of the first meetings I had when I joined Sixth Sense was with my finance partner. And it was really like, hey, help me understand like what your understanding of this build out is going to look like. Here's my strategy. What do you think about this? And so we built the model together. So in essence, I didn't have to ask for any additional headcount because we built it together and we factored it in, right? So I think oftentimes sales leaders want to do it in a silo. We're a lot of times forced to do so, but including them in strategies is really smart.
Yeah, I'd agree, Jess. I partner really closely with my director of RevOps, specifically on our forecasting model and validating all of the assumptions that go into revenue forecasting. Because I think actually from the sales organization perspective, it's a lot easier to obtain headcount and open recs when the model is showing you what they actually deliver at the end of the day. I'm asking for SDRs, when I'm asking for AEs, when I'm asking for AMs, it all ties back to, well, it's to achieve plan. What I would be curious to understand, maybe have some perspective on this, is those non-sales roles. You know, how are you building the business case for, you know, we're hiring a product marketing manager, the ROI on a PMM, and how do I build that into my model and get finance sign off on that? I'd be curious your perspective on things like that.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think that's where, is that going to come out of your budget?
So we're a pretty small organization, about 70 people. So I'll say yes for that answer.
Okay. So for me, I've been fortunate that the organizations that I've scaled for have had cross-functional partners already sort of stood up with their own individual budgets, not to say that they want to use those budgets. So for instance, I want to create a new role at 6 Cents to help support our initiative to go up market. Part of me working with finance was, where do we think this person's budget would live? Right. And so we did that together, and we ultimately decided it was going to fall under our solutions consulting practice. Right. And so that's a whole other conversation of getting that leader on board wanting to do it. I think in your case, I might think about sort of the projected impact or the opportunity cost of not having that individual on staff. Like, I'm sure you've thought about this already, but I think those conversations are meaningful when you're asking for roles that don't have a big ROI, but mostly what's the opportunity cost? What are we going to be missing out on if we don't hire this individual, right? And in the long term, we'll make that up with, you know, bigger deals, more deals, et cetera. But it's sort of a trade-off in the beginning.
Thanks, appreciate it.
Sure.
Hey, Jess, I had a question for you as well. So when you talk about your partnership with the finance team, you know, I have to imagine in the conversations that I've had I work for Alibaba. In the early days, we were building a sales org. So the conversation was more so geared towards how much money are we willing to lose to kind of build the sales team and gain market share, where today the conversation is more geared towards how do we scale a profitable sales org? So when you're having that initial conversation with finance, how do you kind of bring up the topic or have that type of conversation where we're willing to spend X and lose money on, you know, X number of salespeople? Like how does that conversation differ from once you have a scaled out sales organization?
Yeah, that's a very interesting, it's an interesting point at different parts of the sales organization's journey, right? Like the beginning journey is we're willing to lose money up front to help us scale faster. But on the opposite end, as you mentioned, it's more about we already have the budget. How are we going to optimize the productivity of what we have and additive to that? For me, the conversation has really been about tying it directly back to like the revenue targets and the overall business strategy. So if I look at, you know, our CEO and our ELT, they'll put out like our 5 strategic initiatives for the year. right? So I try and have the conversation with finance about, like, if I'm going to put a stake in the ground to build this, we're going to lose some soldiers along the way. We're going to have to spend some money along the way, but I'm tying it to the greater initiatives, not just about hitting the number and growing revenue, but the greater initiatives of the organization. So you get a little bit more buy-in. I think it's transparently, it's a really hard conversation to have, but I think it's one that startups often face, which is like, what is a hire worth? It's actually a great segue into my second point about, like, AE churn is actually way more costly than pull forward hiring. So if you think about that entire question, Jonah, hiring sales teams today is ultimately the most expensive thing to do, right? Like, ultimately sales reps are making anywhere between 150 to 200 plus, right, to get sales reps. When you're thinking about hiring those folks, and I'll circle back to your point. I want to make this one first though, because this is a great conversation to have when finance tells you no, or finance pushes back, which is because you're spending that money, right? It's like 150K plus the other cost to, train. Teddy probably has all of these stats by heart. But what I like to tell finance when they tell me no is that the cost of losing an employee is far greater than pulling someone forward for that hire, right? So you may spend the 150, 200K up front, but if you don't hire and you're trying to put more work and expand on your current capacity, right? The current number of reps you have, then you increase the burnout risk. So if you increase the burnout risk, you increase the chance that you're going to have an AE churn, right? And it takes on average 6.5 months to hire an AE, and it costs almost 200% more to hire someone that's churned, because you have the wait time, you have the sunk cost from the AE that churned, and then on top of that, you have the additional cost of trying to find somebody new, plus the cost of the lost productivity. So on average, all in all, do some back of the napkin math, it's around $2 million to lose an AE versus having that pull forward of 150K. So that's a conversation I like to always have with finance. And that's really interesting when they think about it. But Jonah, back to your question, I think you can kind of do the math backwards from there, right? And say, like, if we do lose some AE hires, or if we do spend a bunch of money up front, right? Like, this is what we're going to get for it. I don't know. To be honest, I've never been in that position where, we're saying we're going to lose a ton of money. I think, you eventually factor in like a couple rep turnover, but that's where the pull forward conversation is really, I think, important.
Got it. Thank you.
I think there's a question in the chat. Chet, what are sunk costs? Sunk costs when you're hiring somebody, right? So when you hire someone, it's not just the salary you're paying them, right? It's the cost of training them. It's the cost of the ramp and, ramped productivity. Those are sunk costs when you're hiring someone. Is that helpful?
Jess, when you're doing pull forward hiring,
Yeah.
how do you think about onboarding, activity, productivity, expectations for that pull forward hire?
Yeah, I think it's very similar, right? I think from a finance perspective, if I get the yes to pull them forward, right, the expectations are that they will still be able to have the same ramp time, the productivity. I can still use my same metrics, my same model for that, but it will just happen sooner, right? So the payoff, the ROI on that hire will happen faster. So even though we're spending money from, a forward quarter now, we will get that payoff faster than if we waited to hire, right, and got the payback.
Hey, Jess, this is Laureen. So
Hi.
I'm on the opposite end. I partner with sales organizations, but from the recruitment perspective.
Great.
And so I've scaled sales organizations. I'm doing it right now, and I've done it before within a corporate entity. So I agree with you 100% about finance because I've seen it happen. both times where finance is not aligned with the overarching mission of the sales leader. And so we slow down. But more than that, I find that it's when they haven't properly done the geographical mapping to determine the location and or have not developed a consistent skill set that they're looking for that causes us to be in recruiting 3 to 6 months behind than where we should be, just because we're told go, go, go. And then we go, well, where? And then behind us are all of the agency recruiters filtering sales resumes because they get wind. And then that adds to the cost of hire. So I'm just curious from your experience, since my experience in my 2 corporate entities and doing the same exact thing, like I said, I'm currently going through it now, the end result was the same. Then we overhire. And then the following year, what I saw previously was every 3 months, then we're now reducing staff because we recognized we scaled in a geography that didn't afford that head count. So can you just share, like, is this normal? Because I can't believe I'm experiencing it twice. What could one in my position do to help mitigate what I foresee coming now in the next 2 to 3 months?
Yeah. Well, thanks for sharing, Laureen. Is it normal? Sure. Right. I mean, I think, businesses make decisions all the time. You've been the recipient of seeing them make the same decision at 2 different companies. What I would say is now you have that experience and knowledge. When I think it's also just as imperative that you are lockstep with the sales leadership as well in being a part of the strategy planning, not just being on the end as a partner of like, okay, here's our strategy, go hire all these people, but more so you are that trusted advisor at the table. So you can say like, look, this is what happened at my last company. We overhired because we hired in geographies that weren't supportive of our go-to-market strategy. We overpaid in areas we should have been underpaying. I think if I were you, I would absolutely demand to be part of the strategy and have that seat at the table to help guide them. And specifically some data and knowledge you can share around benchmarking and geographies. They're probably looking for that information from you as a partner, but it will make you so much more of a valuable partner and trusted partner if you bring that to them. Hey, I saw your, as we're thinking about the plan and scaling into these geographies, I did some basic benchmarking. Here's what people are being paid there. Also, like product market fit, X number of companies that are similar to ours are in this geography or region. Like you kind of want to compare product market fit with also the talent that's there. I think those insights will be incredibly helpful in not over hiring or hiring in the wrong geography or, potentially overpaying, like I said. But I think that could be really helpful, Laureen. I would try that. Yeah, you're welcome.
Jess, we have 4 minutes, so I'm going to shortcut the last topic, which is communicate your plan early and often with a prompt.
Yes.
What's the one thing that you need to communicate more than you think you probably should? And what's the best way, or what's the most unexpectedly valuable way to communicate that information that you wouldn't have thought of?
Specifically with finance, I think vulnerability is an incredible way to build trust and partnership. So in going to finance and being vulnerable to get their feedback and maybe make adjustments, or to have a conversation and ask for help. One of the best conversations I ever had with finance was, help me get this hire done, help me achieve my goal. Like, I don't know how to do it. And I think asking for help and being vulnerable in that way, like then we really dug in, we really figured out, how to make the ROI model work and the pull forward, like I said, with all the math. That was, I think, the best thing I could have done, right? Is really just asked for help, make them part of my strategy, make them part of my plan. right, to scale. And it's been successful so far, scaled lots of teams, and finance and I are super tight, but it's not always easy. So 3 minutes. Any last questions or comments?
Thanks, Jess. It's great.
You got it.
I love asking a question of a group of sales leaders and then watching everybody just sit in silence for like a really long time because everybody's super comfortable with it. Thank you, Jess, for this. It was super helpful. We're going to do a couple of these monthly meetups, and this was like a cool, relatively small, intimate group. I would love to see your faces on the next one. And if it's this size again, I think one lesson for me coming out of this conversation is to give each of you, like if this was going to be 20 people, we can't do intros around the room. But if next time it's 5 or 6, we'll make room for that because I think it'll add a little bit of color and character to the conversation. And again, like our hope is, as brought a part of Pavilion, that we build a group, a cohort of folks who really are committed to doing great sales hiring together. And so it'd be fun to be on that journey with y'all. So Jess, thank you for your time. I not only now thank you for bringing us into Sales Loft, but now for this conversation. So if anybody has like a really, really good recommendation for a bottle of wine, I owe Jess 2. Chris, thank you for organizing, and to everybody on the line, thank you for being super active participants. It was a fun conversation.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Cheers all.
Thank you guys. Bye-bye.